Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Again, can you believe it? I can't believe it. We're doing this so soon since we talked to each other last. That's crazy. We were thinking about doing this every other week, but just based upon the feedback that we received from all of you that listened to episode 1, we're doing it a week ahead of time, and maybe we'll do it every week going forward instead of every other week. How great would that be? So, hey, welcome to 1980. Welcome to the 80s, generally speaking. Are you ready? I'm not sure that I am, because let me tell you, 1980 is crazy. There's just an explosion of ideas happening. It's possible that some of this stuff happened starting in 1975 or whatever. Anything before 79, I have no idea, but in 80, things have officially exploded. So I'm really excited to go through not only this year, but I'm a little bit apprehensive about going through 81, 2, 3, 4, and so on, because I kind of remember a little bit that the amount of music that I start to keep every year is going up and up and up. So it's going to be really hard to figure out my 15 to 20 essential albums for the year and why. So let's all have fun with the fact that I'm going to really struggle with this. This is just a reminder that you should check out the playlists that are linked in the episode description for this episode. You can check them out and listen to them at your convenience. Last thing, I also got some feedback that the rating scales that I was using last episode, a little bit complicated, so I'm just going to shrink this thing down, make it even more efficient, because I think that that's what we're trying to get to here at the end of the day, is a more efficient experience for all of you. So I'm really just going to call out if I think that a particular album that I've put in my essentials is a challenging listen, and beyond that, we're not even going to talk about it, because if you just assume it's low and medium complexity, we don't even really have to talk about it. You could just experience it for yourself, just like I did when I listened to some of this stuff and thought, wow, this is really tough to listen to, but I kind of like it. So I'll give you a warning ahead of time, so you don't have to exactly go into it knowing nothing like I did, so I'll help you out a little bit. Anyway, as always, we're going to talk about music trends. So what's moving in? What's hot right now? What's moving out? We're going to talk about my essential albums for this year and why, and also my conspicuous absences from my essential list and why. So this year, in 1980, what's moving in? It's a lot of revivals. We got ska revival is still kind of happening. I didn't keep anything from 1980 in my essential albums for ska this year, but you could just sort of presume that it's still around and doing its thing, even if it's not part of my essential albums. Reggae revival, very exciting. I know that Bob Marley came out with one of his most important albums, as this being the sort of tail end of his career in 1980. I did put it in my regular big list. It's not on my essential list. But then there's the sort of new generation of reggae that's coming on, clearly. And it's a high degree of experimentation. It's still obviously got the fundamentals of reggae, kind of like ska, but it's just going in a totally different direction. And I kept one of those in my essential album, so we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to it. Next, country revival. I think country is always sort of happening, kind of like reggae. And the only reason I call this country revival is that for anybody that was listening to the radio or what have you in the 90s, there was clearly this cresting wave of country music. Think about Garth Brooks, think about Clint Black, George Strait, all these popular artists that came out in the mid-90s. It sort of started in, at least my estimation, around the late 70s, early 80s. And so that uptick is starting to happen again, where there are a few different albums that are just in my big list that are worth listening to, just to help ground yourself in what's going on with country at the moment. But because of that, I can say for certain that country music is on the way up again. And when we say revival in this case, my interpretation is it's more kind of like that big hat country from the 60s and 70s, not necessarily like frontier country, like cowboy country. Like we're talking about, the highly commercialized idea of country music. That's on the way back up. So country revival. Rockabilly revival is also on the way up. This is, again, I didn't necessarily keep anything that was strictly rockabilly in my essential albums, but there's a lot of influences of rockabilly all throughout these essential albums, and they will continue to permeate through a lot of these essential albums and on my big list as we keep moving along, because the rockabilly revival is clearly happening in the early 80s, which, frankly, I was not aware of when I first started doing this project. Now, obviously, I'm aware of it, but I wasn't aware of it. And this is actually funny, too, because back when I was a kid, I was a huge fan of the movie Eddie and the Cruisers, right? Total rockabilly. But because of that, I just never put it together that it was a hot sound in any respect back then. So it's clearly on the way up. Even in 1980, there's a lot of heavy influences going on, and we'll talk about them as we get to some albums that are essential that we kept because of that. And then finally, new wave punk. We were talking about it last year. It's still on the way up. I don't think it's totally found the plateau yet, but there's several albums that either are strictly new wave punk or are heavily influenced by it that are in my essential albums. We'll talk about it more, but new wave punk is clearly still on the way up. There's still a lot of experimentation happening. Like I said, we haven't leveled off yet, so we're not exactly on trend just yet. What's hot right now? Power pop is still hot, I believe. I didn't keep any of them in my essential albums. There's one or two in the bigger list, but it's clear the power pop is not yet waning. Like there's still a lot of juice yet to squeeze from it being on the mountaintop. And then new wave, both in terms of heavy metal and pop, I declare officially that they are on the mountaintop at this point. It's everywhere. There's a bunch of different interpretations of it, and they're all readily available and accessible. They're all highly consumable. I think it's still the beginning of it being on trend because there's still a lot of people playing with a lot of different ideas. But it's just, I detect it's a little bit more out in the open than it was perhaps last year, where people were still playing with some ideas behind the curtain. And now you get to see all of these new ideas just kind of exploding everywhere. I also think that there's even more confidence and certainty around at least the pop sound. Maybe not necessarily the heavy metal sound. I think that there's a tiny bit still that needs to be ironed out, but it's popular enough where I perceive that it's on trend. So both heavy metal, new wave heavy metal, and new wave pop, to me, are on trend officially. And then finally, what's moving out is traditional heavy metal, which I think it was already moving out last year. I don't think it's totally gone yet or totally over. There's some signs of the end times around heavy metal traditional, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then traditional reggae. I would say that reggae revival coming in is effectively pushing out traditional reggae from the scene altogether. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to that one album that I kept. That's a really excellent example of just kind of pushing traditional reggae and, unfortunately, Bob Marley out of the way. Now let's talk about essential albums for the year and why. There's 20 of them. There's 18 of them, and then I actually have 2 J-pop check-ins. So it's a little bit longer than it was last year. So it just goes to show that there was a little bit more going on in 1980 than 79, I think, or at least as far as things that I thought were interesting enough to keep. So, and again, this is in order of artist, alphabetical. It's not in order of my preference. It's not in order of how excellent it was. I will call something out if I really, really liked it, but it's just in alphabetical order by the artist, again. So, first off, AC/DC, Back in Black. It's late-stage traditional heavy metal. It's so clear that much like last year's Nick Lowe's Labor of Lust, that this is, again, one of those big, excellent send-offs to the traditional heavy metal sound. It's a little bit leaning into, I would say, the new wave of heavy metal, but this is towards the tail end of AC/DC's big run. You know, they've been on a hot run for the last several years. I had Highway to Hell, an excellent album also, in my 1979 big list. It didn't make it to the essential albums. I find that Back in Black is that tremendous send-off where it's super tight, it's extraordinarily confident. Obviously, they know exactly what they're doing. Bon Scott is a fantastic singer and knows exactly what to do with his voice. It's a tremendous album. One thing I'll call out about this album is it has, to me, one of the best intros to an album, like a track one, side one, you'll find. And we do progressively get those, and I'll call them out as we go along here, because I'm a big believer in capturing adequate attention of the listener from the get-go. Hell's Bells is the track, the first track, and it does such an excellent job of inching you into the album. And if you've never heard AC/DC before, or the person at the time in 1980 listening to this record had never heard of AC/DC before somehow, that it very incrementally introduces you to their sound gradually, and it makes you get interested in every single piece that they add to the song before you realize by the end of it, you're totally rocking out and you're completely ready for the next track, which is also an excellent track. So I think that they do such a great job of drawing the listener in piece by piece so that by the time you're fully in their sound, you're totally aware of what they are, what they do, and why they're exciting to listen to, which I think is quite humbling for a band that is already so well established as AC/DC is in 1980, because they could just as easily say, people know who we are, they don't need to be introduced to us, and all those things that come along with perceiving that everybody knows who you are, so we don't need to waste time, we'll just get right to it. And they don't get right to it. They ease you in, and it's fantastic how they do it. It is late stage traditional heavy metal. Like, you can really tell that, compared to some of these other heavy metal albums that we have on the Essential albums for this year, that it seems certainly more confident than a lot of these, but also there's not a high degree of experimentation. They're just doing what they're doing, and they're doing it well. So, number 2, Billy Joel, Glass Houses. This should be an obvious one, much like Back in Black. Billy Joel was a paragon. He still is a paragon, right? Even today, he just came out with new music over the last 6 months. Like, he's still doing it. It's amazing. This album is considered one of his many peaks. The great thing about it to me, despite the fact that it's very popular, which is almost never a metric for me that's important, is that he merges rockabilly revival with new wave and power pop together. So there's clearly some rockabilly influences, which is really great. I don't personally know a lot about Billy Joel, other than the fact that he's wildly famous. So if it's a hallmark for him that he incorporates rockabilly into his stuff, depending on what era he's in, great. This is clearly what he does, and he's taking new wave and power pop ideas and merging them together. And the great thing about this to me is he's definitively helping to usher both eras along, where he's certainly sitting in the power pop side, he's sitting in the new wave side, and he's sitting in the rockabilly side, putting them together, because clearly power pop is the vehicle that's on trend right now, using that to help boost up new wave, which is still new to the on trend scene, and rockabilly revival, which probably isn't exactly there yet. Like, it's still moving in, like we were talking about. So the fact that he's trying to mobilize all three of them and boost up all three of them at once by using power pop as that vehicle, like, yeah, you really like this sort of power pop sound. Let me introduce you to these other couple little ideas that get you excited and interested in perhaps what's coming next, or what's maybe a little bit underground still. So that's really awesome. I mean, it's clear to me just listening to this album that he's a great steward of different ideas in music, and he likes using popular ideas in order to give a voice and a platform to perhaps more experimental ideas still. And clearly he knows how to merge them all together into a consumable package. So genius, fantastic, give it a listen. It's great. Next, Dead Kennedys, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables. It's new wave punk. It's fabulous. It's anarchistic. The subjects aren't unexpected for, punk music. They're talking about the end of the world. They're talking about the state of things being terrible. They're talking about, the sort of day-to-day idiosyncrasies and minutia that are just annoying and little nitpicks about stuff. But they do it in such a compelling, interesting, anxiety-inducing way that the delivery is just fabulous. It's clearly new wave punk versus being traditional punk, because as traditional punk, I would say, is more focused specifically on being angry, upset, resistant to what is popular, what is current, what is on trend, the sort of banality of pop culture that was prevalent in punk during its early days. There's such a heightened level of anxiety that comes along with new wave, because when we think about new wave, we think about sort of the disembodied synthetic anxiety about the 80s moment that we found ourselves in. Like, there was so much uncertainty that existed in the 80s, and there was just a lot of turmoil that it created a lot of new, fresh anxiety about what was to come, especially around the technological future that was coming for us all, clearly. And so the Dead Kennedys, in this case, have pushed the envelope around punk to veer into this highly anxious but angry place. And it's just excellent music to listen to. And it's so clear, too, that new wave punk, while not exactly all the way on the mountaintop, like it's not exactly on trend, it's polished enough, and there's enough of an idea there that it's pretty clear that it's moving in fast and furious, and we should be expecting it to crest very soon. Next, Echo and the Bunnymen, Crocodiles. It's new wave. It's post-punk. It's a little bit more depressing than the Dead Kennedys were. It's highly influential music. I think that it's still like 5% uncooked. And not to say that's what they were going for specifically, but I think that there's still more for them to do to refine their sound and their ideas, but they're headed in a super productive direction, which is really exciting for them. I mean, anybody that knows about 80s rock music or anything around the melancholy pre-emo new wave, very familiar with Echo and the Bunnymen. This shouldn't be a surprise to any of those people, especially like also in that post-punk mindset. But to me, this is such an exciting album because it signals what's to come, both with post-punk and what eventually comes with emo music. Because early emo is really great, and this is just a great vehicle in order to take us to those great heights that I know that we're going to get to. So give this one a listen to. It's a little bit on the complicated side, just again, because it gets you into a very specific headspace in a way like Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures, but not as deep down in the dirt. Like I think that there's some elevation here because it is a little bit more new wave than just strictly post-punk, but it is really great. So give it a listen. Next, Girls' School Demolition. This is new wave of British heavy metal to a T. It's just got the really excellent guitar work. It's not exactly arena rock like, AC/DC's Back in Black was. It's clearly ushering in that new wave of British heavy metal that's distinctly different than traditional heavy metal. And you can hear it in the vocals. You can hear it in how they play the instruments. It's a little less big and a little bit more gritty. It's kind of like punk, but not really, which is why it's this sort of new wave of heavy metal. One of the other things to call out about this album is it's one of the extraordinarily rare female voices in a typically very male-dominated genre, especially for this era. I think there might be only one other meaningful example besides them. So Girls' School Demolition is, I would say, groundbreaking, especially for a lot of the female-led rock groups of the late 80s, early mid-90s. The thing also I will point out about this album is that it is not totally polished, but that is half the fun to me. It sounds like they just got in a room with no windows and just put a microphone on the floor and they just started playing music. Like, it feels super raw. And there's a lot of room for them to polish if they wanted to, but I don't really perceive that that's a priority for them, which I think is kind of half the fun. Because I think that the ideas are there, and I think that they're executing what they sought out to execute, but it just sounds like kind of on that raw side, like you want to think about the White Stripes. Like, there's a rawness to it that's really great. Next, Curtis Blow by Curtis Blow. This is hyper early rap. Some might even sit there and think, what is this album even doing here in this moment? It's super underground. It's the early protozoan era of rap, still being done at house parties. It provides an excellent early education about what rap was doing at the moment, right? Not going into a whole rant about the early eras of rap, but at least in this moment, rap was almost exclusively still back in the house parties with an MC, Master of Ceremonies, that was taking somebody, either themselves being the DJ and, working out the breaks on the records, or somebody else was doing it. And then they were essentially just doing that kind of carnival barker back and forth thing where they were engaging with the audience. And you can hear that in what Curtis Blow's doing, right? This isn't NWA where they're just rapping about whatever they're going to rap about. It is a totally organic experience where he's going back and forth with the audience. It's almost live. It feels like it's live. But the reality is that this is just what rap was at the time, and Curtis Blow, being the genius, or the people that influenced him into making this album, the geniuses that they were trying to give a platform and a voice to this new burgeoning thing that was happening in New York City at the time. It's really great stuff. It's totally other than whatever else is going on in the rest of this year for 1980. It's totally other. So because of that, it's just a great, first of all, introduction to rap in case you don't really know the origins of this current era of rap, like where it came from and how it evolved. This is, to me, one of the very definitive beginnings of it. So give it a listen. If nothing else, it's just super fun. Just listening to him do his thing is super fun. So give it a listen. Next, Michael Schenker Group. Michael Schenker Group. That is the name of the album. It's eponymous. Traditional heavy metal, but it's playing with 2 or 3 maybe new wave ideas. It's not super inventive. It's not super experimentational, but Michael Schenker is a guitar virtuoso. clearly. I mean, he's an excellent guitar player. It really comes across in the music. The vocals are middling. I wouldn't say that they're mind-blowing. I also would say that there's a little bit of repetition when it comes to the album. One of my favorite tracks across all the albums from this year is in this album. It's towards the end. I'm not going to tell you what it is to encourage you to go listen to it, but Michael Schenker is a genius, clearly. And this is another great send-off to traditional heavy metal where, again, like we were talking about the prior year in 79 or even in episode 0, there's a little bit of that we need to play with whatever is new and hot or coming on to continue to maintain our place at the top or continue to capture listeners' attention versus we want to experiment just for the sake of experimentation. We're trying to throw additional ideas that are hot in there in order to kind of keep our relevance. No shade on Michael Schenker Group or anything like that, but it's just kind of what happens. So give this one a listen. I think you could probably get through a track or two, get the point, and maybe move along. But to me, it's still critical listening for 1980 just because he's an excellent guitar player and we should all honor that. Next, new music with a K from A to B. To me, this is the clearest sign that new wave has arrived. It's so excellent. It's so confident. It's so polished. The ideas that they're playing with seem totally cooked, as if to say, we're not necessarily experimenting with new wave ideas anymore. We're just declaring that these are the ideas that we are officially going to use going forward as a movement. It's varied in where it goes in the new wave sound. Some of these tracks you'll listen to sound like they should be in 1995 or 6, so it's clearly ahead of its time in some respects, but they do it so confidently. There's so much competence there where they clearly sat down and thought about what they wanted to do, and then they did it, and it's excellent. And I wouldn't say that a lot of people know who New Music is. You can't even really find them on social media too much. They've kind of disappeared, which is a shame because this one album is, to me, at least somewhat influential. It's one of those albums, too, in 1980 that sounds a little bit like it's out of time, like it's out of place in time. This album could have come out anytime between now and the next 35 years from now, and I think it still would have been well received. It's really excellent stuff. It's one of my favorites this year. I could listen to this album anytime. It's really great. Excellent. Give it a listen. Next, Roots Radix, Junjo Presents Heavyweight Dub Champion. This, to me, is that reggae revival album that I was promising that we were going to talk about. To me, it's highly experimentational. It's highly ambitious. There's a huge degree of vulnerability that the group of Roots Radix is putting out there. It's, I would say in the nicest way possible, trying to move traditional reggae out of the way so that they can get a bigger voice, a bigger platform for the listening audience to talk about where they think the future of reggae is going. And spoiler alert, they are right. There's a huge amount of experimentation here while still holding true to the fundamentals. And I love this album. It's also one of my favorites from this year, just because it's such a precursor to so many different ideas, both within reggae, but then just dub in general. There's just a lot there. And it also reminded me as I was going through how excited I am about some of the reggae artists that are going to come over the next several years that I also look forward to putting in my essential album. So this to me was a really early example of this new age of reggae. So give this one a really good listen. Rush, Permanent Waves is next. It's traditional plus heavy metal, new wave, all put together into one package. It's super tight. It's like 6 tracks. Rush clearly has a foot in both camps here. They've got a foot in new wave heavy metal. They've got a foot in traditional heavy metal. But like I said, it's super tight. It's super confident. Rush kind of has its own brand, kind of what they sing about, the sounds they play. The vocals are clearly distinctive. Good for Rush for just having such a distinctive brand that is all their own. I think that bands come along over time either to pay homage to Rush or to their own peril try to copy Rush. And it just doesn't work that well because Rush is just who they are and what they are. Permanent Waves is one of their best albums. Like I said, it's super brief and it's highly consumable. I would just give it a listen in case you either haven't listened to it in a long time or you've never heard Rush before. And I guarantee you that at some point in your life, you've accidentally heard something from this album. So give it a listen. It's really great. Can't possibly say enough about it. Next, this is the only artist that has been on the list twice already, Talking Heads. No surprise there. Remain in the Light. It was a great album from 1980. It's clear that new wave is marching forward. New wave pop, new wave synth pop in this case specifically. It's clear that they're continuing to refine their ideas. It's clear that they have a very strong vision. Here's what I'll say about Talking Heads in this moment is where I find that a lot of artists will commit, it's not a cardinal sin, but it's kind of high up there for me, that if they keep rolling with one idea over and over again, and this can happen within a track, it can happen within an album, sometimes it can happen across multiple albums, and obviously as they do it more and more, it becomes more of an egregious violation for me, that they'll sit on one idea for such a long time because either they just really love this one idea and they can't possibly get off of it to another one, or they unfortunately perceive that this is the one idea that they've got, and they have worry that if they get off this idea, they don't have a lot of other additional ideas to use in their pocket in order to keep people attracted to their music. The way that I often think about it is in sitcoms where they'll do a romance storyline of a will they, won't they sort of circumstance between two characters, and they'll just draw it out forever and ever and ever. The ever and ever and ever always says to me that they don't have enough ideas in order to just establish that it happens and then move on to other creative pursuits in storylines, right? So this is an example where they committed themselves to some really great ideas in 79, and then they've pivoted off of them into totally different ideas that certainly are an evolution from what they did in Fear of Music, but they're going in different places, which to me says that they have confidence in their own creativity to leave some ideas by the wayside and keep moving on to other ideas because they've got a lot of them. And so to me, Remain in the Light is just an example of them continuing to establish and send signals to their listening audience that they have a lot of ideas, so you should keep paying attention to them because they've got a lot to offer and they're not just going to keep playing the same thing for you over and over and over again and just keep. So good for them. It all comes across in this music. I would even recommend perhaps listening to Fear of Music a little bit and then going and listening to this and comparing and contrasting them, just because they both have similar threads, right? It's the same artist, but they're clearly pushing past some of the stuff they fully realized in 79 and moving on to new stuff. It's really great. I love the confidence. Next, The Buggles, The Age of Plastic. It's very new wave synth pop. It sounds like Sparks to a certain extent. I don't really know the relationship between the Buggles and Sparks, and if there's a direct influence there, I'm not totally sure. But they were all clearly enjoying the same ideas, and so this sounds like Number One in Heaven to a certain extent, but they've refined it. They're taking it to different, more exciting places. There's a little bit more confidence and a little less of that totally free and open experimentation from Sparks from last year. There's a little bit more certainty, like we're going to do these specific ideas and they're going to be really great. Obviously, there is one big hit on here that many would argue that Video Killed the Radio Star was their one hit. I would argue that this album has a lot to love on it, and the tracks that you listen to get to Video Killed the Radio Star are all really great, and they give a really good indication of, again, the many ideas that the Buggles have in this case, and also the really exciting direction that new wave synth pop is going in. It doesn't even really matter that there's a huge hit on this album, because you could just file it with all the rest of the great songs on here and enjoy the album. It's super consumable. Go for it. Next, The Police, Zenyatta Mandata. It's new wave, it's reggae, it's jazz, it's blue-eyed soul. It's shoving all these ideas into one package, and they do it pretty consumably, which I think is pretty amazing. They're trying to pull together this one vision, and it kind of works. I think that anybody that's aware of Sting today, or I would say over the last 20 years, he has a very particular kind of jazz soul vibe to him. The Police were taking those ideas even back then and trying to merge them with new wave ideas. There was a lot of reggae influences in there too, which also, again, is why I'm excited about where we're going in reggae with Roots Radics, because all of that new generation reggae is going to influence people that want to use reggae and their ideas too, but take the more, I would say, experimental versions of it, which it's all really exciting. The one thing I'll say about the Police in this album, in Zenyatta Mandata, is that sometimes merging all these disparate ideas together works and sometimes it doesn't. It's essential nonetheless. I would say their ambition is the most attractive thing about this album, just because new wave and reggae and jazz and soul don't necessarily need to work together or should work together in a lot of cases, but taking them and moving the ingredients around the plate and then coming up with these new beautiful things is part of the fun here. Sometimes it doesn't taste great and sometimes it tastes amazing. So I would invite you to give it a listen to yourself and see what works for you and what doesn't, just because there's a lot of experimentation with a lot of different ideas going on here. Next, The Soft Boys, Underwater Moonlight. Honestly, I don't even know what this album is doing in 1980. Just because it's slacker rock. This is like early Pavement, right? This is an album that should have come out in 1991. It's clearly a decade ahead of where everything else is. It's kind of disorienting that it's here. It's obviously hyper influential because to one degree or another, so many of those artists in the early 90s that came out with this music in force must have listened to this album one or more times in order to get that inspiration. They must have heard it and said, wow, this is a really out there idea. I wonder if I can replicate it and do more with it, right? That's what we talked about in episode 0. It's one idea and somebody figures out how to mobilize it into even more of a thing than it was before, even more consumable, even more exciting. So the Soft Boys' Underwater Moonlight is a album out of space and time, kind of like the Curtis Blow album or even the New Music album, where you sit there and go, this doesn't distinctly sound like what I understand the 1980s, even 1980s specifically to be, but it's a great album. And obviously, considering where it happens in space and time, it must have been some big bang in its own right. So got to give this one a listen because it's kind of like observing the beginning of something that is going to proliferate untold amounts of creativity across the universe of music. So give that one a listen. Next, The Undertones, Hypnotized. It's new wave punk, just like Dead Kennedys is new wave punk, because, at least in my estimation, they kind of sound similar. They're similar ideas. I mean, this may very well upset both Dead Kennedys and the Undertones and their diehard fans, but to me, either they, for some reason, had deep inspiration from similar sources that happened before 1979, which is totally possible, or they were staying up all night long, dishing on the phone about what these albums were going to be, and then they just merged all their ideas together into kind of similar albums. Either way, it was tremendous. And the great thing is that it's just another great interpretation of this early new wave punk movement. I would highly encourage you to listen to this album and Dead Kennedys' Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables right up against each other. Not at the same time. That's a little, too much cacophony. Listen to one and then listen to the other and see what the similarities and the differences are, because it's two different interpretations of kind of the same idea, which to me, like art, if, you're in an art school, for example, and everybody that's in the class is expected to like paint a water pitcher and everybody's angle is a little bit different, the shadow as a result is a little bit different on some of that. Obviously, everybody's skill and their interpretation of what the carafe is slightly different, but you can see the similarities and the differences based upon what everybody was viewing as this one idea. So to me, just purely from a music history perspective, listening to these two albums is critical to best understand the new wave punk idea. Because if we're thinking about astrophysics and we're thinking about this big bang of where this original idea came from, that these are two really good viewpoints and hints to kind of help triangulate and figure out what were they both getting inspired by in order for us to elicit these two similar but still distinctive ideas in these different albums. It's just really great stuff. And also, by the way, it's a great album by itself. Okay, next, Ultravox, Vienna. It's new wave synth pop. It's really great. One could call it another Sparks acolyte, but again, I don't know the relationship between Ultravox and Sparks, but the inspiration is clearly there. Like either they were all listening to the same things or Ultravox was listening to Sparks. Either way, Ultravox is clearly on the path that Sparks was also walking. But I would say Ultravox is further out there, right? There's more polish. There's some tremendous tracks on this album that are still experimentational. They're still experimenting, clearly, but they've clearly found some things to ground themselves on and that really work, and they're just mobilizing them to the furthest extents. It's much more confident. I love this album too. It's really great. It's an excellent listen. It's a little bit complicated, but it's not so much so that if I'm calling it new wave synth pop, you probably know what you're getting into with it. Ultravox is one of the major players in the original new wave synth pop movement, so I would give them a listen, if nothing else, to ground yourself in what is clearly hot right now in 1980, but also it's just a really great album. Give it a listen. Next up, Visage by Visage. It's new wave. It's the beginning, I would say, of the new romantic movement, which for those that are not familiar with the new romantic subgenre of new wave, there's a certain degree of theatricality and drama about the new romantic style. Like that's what it's all about. It's taking new wave and adding theatrics and drama on top of it. There's like a Baroque component to it where it just comes across like overly dramatic. I think a really great example of it artistically is just looking at the cover of this album. That to me is a really great example of what new romantic is in this moment and then also will become, because new romantic I don't think hits for several more years. There's a lot more that still yet needs to happen in the new romantic movement for it to find footing. And I also don't necessarily call it what's moving in necessarily, because it is really a more artistic offshoot but it's still firmly new wave. It's just a slightly different way to address new wave, and it's its own thing. There are specific sounds to it. I think if you listen to Visage, you'll start to get some indications of what that is. But as we go along too, in the 80s, I'll be calling out when something is very distinctly no romantic so that you're getting educated too, because I was having to learn all this stuff myself, where I was listening to this album and others like it as we went along in years. And I'm like, why do they keep sounding like this one particular thing? It's very interesting. And I had to put that together, that they were following a very distinctive movement. Because the thing is, at no point was I following the actual history of music as I was going along. I was just getting these albums, listening to them, and making totally disconnected impressions and totally disconnected assumptions about what I was listening to. Sometimes what I was listening to sounded great and maybe it wasn't well received, and sometimes it was. You know, it's totally subjective, totally up to interpretation. But in this moment for Visage, they were ushering in this new romantic idea. They're considered to be pioneers of the new romantic movement. So give this one a listen, give it a couple tracks just so you can kind of get a feel for what that is. Also, I would really encourage you to juxtapose this sound to what Ultravox is doing, what the Buggles are doing, what new music is doing. Give Visage a listen. It's just really fun. It's good to, like I said, compare things up to, and also just enjoying it for what it is. Finally, before we do our J-pop check-in, Young Marble Giants, Colossal Youth. Somehow this is late stage new wave, but also like early alternative rock. I have to imagine this is a highly influential album. It's tremendous. It's a great album. It's highly ambitious. It's super vulnerable like the Soft Boys. And they're clearly just doing their own thing. Like, I wish I could get into the headspace of the Young Marble Giants as they were thinking about this album, because to my estimation, they were just looking at where new wave was and where it was going. And rather than just climbing out onto the mountaintop and just sitting there and saying, we're on the top, we're just living in this new sound, this new idea moment, and it's super popular, they instead decided that they were going to slingshot themselves all the way over the top of the mountain and land on the other side and say, you know what, we're going to live at the end of new wave, and we're going to play with some new ideas that go way beyond the bounds of just whatever people think they're going to be getting into, you know, like the Buggles or Talking Heads or Ultravox. We're just going to go all the way past that. We're going to go all the way past what Dead Kennedys are doing, certainly what AC/DC is doing. Just we're going to go past all this stuff and just land in early alternative rock. It's, again, out of space and time. It doesn't make any sense. It's really fantastic. It's like looking at cave paintings. Like you listen to this music and go, wow, how are they coming up with these ideas in 1980, these sounds? It's just a great example of that. And clearly all those bands that came after were super influenced by Young Marble Giants. So give this one a listen if you want to kind of have that history. Also, it's a great album, by the way. Okay, 2 check-in albums with J-pop this year, neither of which are actual J-pop. They're, I would say, rock in their own way. So the first is Bow Wow, not to be confused with the rapper Bow Wow, but the Japanese rock band Bow Wow. The record is Glorious Road, and the interesting thing about this album is that it shows that Japan isn't actually as far behind in their rock as they are with their pop music. There's certainly a lot of inspiration being taken here. I would actually encourage you to listen to it and try and guess out all the different sounds that they're borrowing in order to make this album. It's a super fun game that I enjoy playing. There's obviously a certain degree of complexity with it, because unless you know Japanese, you're going to miss some of this stuff, but you listen to the music and you can hear their inspirations. One of my favorite things about this record, and also a lot of records as we go along in Korean and Japanese popular music, is that at least in these early stages, some of these bands will come out with records that are in a way reflecting back the sounds that are coming to them from the Western world. So what you'll have is not necessarily them trying to actively copy them in order to say, yeah, we can do this music too, which might possibly be the case in some instances, but more to say, hey, we're here too, we hear you. It's like if we were sending signals out to space and they got reflected back to us to say, yeah, we hear you. We're here too. We're enjoying this music just like you are. Hey, look, we can kind of play this stuff too. Not to denigrate, Bow Wow or anybody else that's doing that music, but that's how it comes across to me, that they're not doing it because they want to capitalize on the sound too. I mean, they might be, but also to say that we're gathering all this great inspiration from the West, and we want to be able to reflect that back out into the world, especially in our own individual cultures, so that they get exposed to this stuff too, so that we can push the boundaries of what is on trend, in our geographies too. So it's super fun stuff. As far as like the rest of this music that you're going to listen to, Glorious Road isn't going to be groundbreaking to you unless insofar as them singing in Japanese is meaningfully different for you from a listening perspective. But it's just a really great example of kind of what's happening in this moment, at least in Japan. So give that one a quick listen. I would even say give it a track, give it 2 tracks maybe, just so you get the flavor. And if it's your vibe, great, keep going. And if it's not, you've had the example and you can move on. Finally, Plastics. Welcome to Plastics. Truthfully, this is really just like the Japanese B-52s, which I find to be super fun and super interesting. It's, again, another one of those signal reflections back from Japan, from America in this case. And it also gives that heavy indication, once again, that like even if current Japanese popular music is a little bit stuck in the 70s, that Plastics is signaling that new wave pop and new wave heavy metal and punk, like all those ideas that the B-52s play with are influencing somebody in Japan at least. And again, they're saying, we hear you, we love your stuff, we want to be like this even more and bring these ideas to our shores so that more people can appreciate it like we do, because maybe some people in Japan aren't as willing to listen to music in English, that there's some kind of barrier there. So they said, we're going to do our own version of it so that maybe you can appreciate it like we love it, right? It's really great. And it's just the idea of being able to proliferate some of these sounds in Japan is part of the fun of going on this parallel path journey with what's going on in the West. And it eventually will show up similarly in the Korean popular music side once we get to the, I would say, late 80s, early 90s, when K-pop starts to emerge. Okay. Let's move into our conspicuous absences. There's 5 of them. First of all, the Psychedelic Furs by the Psychedelic Furs. So first of all, what I want to say is that all of these albums are on my big list. So it's not like I've cut them out of my life altogether. I still find them to be valuable and important in their own right. I just didn't find them to be critical for my essential list. So Psychedelic Furs is my first album. To me, honestly, it just sounded like David Bowie on a sad day. It's not ready, which is saying something about the Psychedelic Furs, because they will have already been around for a minute, and obviously they will continue to be around for a while. And it just didn't sound enough like a different thing than David Bowie. And David Bowie was already pushing envelopes in his album, which again is on my big list. It's not even on my conspicuous absences. Like, yeah, I know Fashion is on it. It's a great track. Totally get it. But he was already trying to push things differently. He was trying to take his own sound in different directions. And the Psychedelic Furs to me just sounded like David Bowie. I'm happy for them. I'm happy for all the people that love them. Not interesting to me. Next, Pretenders by Pretenders. It's just one idea over and over and over again. I love the band endlessly. I love Chrissie Hynde, like, as a person. It wasn't interesting to me. Like, yeah, it was one good idea in track 1 and then track 2 and 3. And I'm starting to disengage as I'm listening, because I'm like, yeah, I get that it's good. I get that it's meaningful. I get that her sound is great and it's distinctive. But like, they're not going anywhere. Like, it's just one idea over and over and over again. So I didn't need to make that essential. But I do acknowledge that as a singular idea, it's good and also meaningful for 1980, which is why I called it out. Next, Ozzy Osbourne, Blizzard of Oz. So obviously, I didn't put Black Sabbath, Heaven and Hell on my essential albums list or my conspicuous absences list, even though there's a couple tracks on that album that I really like a lot, but it wasn't noteworthy enough in order to keep in either regard. But the thing is about Blizzard of Oz that it's a big stepping out moment for Ozzy, especially because Black Sabbath came out with a fairly popular album that year. Ronnie James Dio was doing the vocals for it. Like, it was a big moment. But here's the thing. I love Ozzy endlessly. And I'm worried or delighted that he would, care about what I have to say about his album and then come for me. Either way, doesn't matter. Or any of his fans. There's some good ideas in here. I will totally give it that. Ozzy is totally distinctive as a voice. He's clearly got a very distinctive perspective. There's a lot of tracks on here that are great. I mean, Crazy Train's on it, etc. There's some tracks on here that I will listen to over and over and over again. However, the production on this album is rough. It is rough. Some of I'm not a production purist, but I tend to give things a little bit of a pass around production if people are trying highly experimentational things. This has noticeably poor production to it. And what I mean by that is just some of the edits aren't super great. Some of the audio levels aren't super great. It's pretty uneven, which is surprising for me. It's noteworthy because Ozzy Osbourne should be with some producer that is absolutely crushing it, and it's not, which is weird. It's weird and noteworthy to me. And the other thing is, I think, honestly, that the instrumentation is pretty lazy and not on purpose. Because I think as we start to go along, the idea of playing your instruments a little bit on the rough side is part of the fun and part of the slackerdom of that sound. But in this case, there's notes missing, there's beats that are missing or off. There's a lot here where I'm sitting there going, could they have not just recut this song? Could they have not re-recorded this song? It sounds like a lot of rough edges on this stuff, and I can't imagine that it's on purpose. I just can't. I don't want to believe that it's on purpose. So if some huge Ozzy fan comes to me in the comments and says, oh, no, they were doing that on purpose, I say, great, then it was genius. But in this case, just listening to it, it shouldn't be something that I pay attention to as I'm listening to it, where I want to be paying attention to what Ozzy's doing, what he's singing about, because it's all really great stuff, but then it just keeps invading my ears going, oh, that note was off. Oh, that note was off. Oh, that beat was off. Oh, that sounds like a really weird cut, And so because of that, I honor that Blizzard of Oz is excellent. I'm really hopeful and excited that his next album that comes out in a year or two is going to be in an even higher place, like they would have refined some stuff. But this year, not for me. Sorry. Next, Judas Priest, British Steel, kind of like The Pretenders. It's just super repetitious. Like, I get that British Steel and Judas Priest were super important in the early 80s, especially as, at least in the United States, where we were struggling to define the safety of rock music and how heavy metal was like rotting the brains of our children and all sorts of nonsense like that. And I know that Judas Priest was a very vocal proponent for the importance of heavy metal and its, impacts on counterculture and everything. This album, though, is, to me, highly repetitious. The first track is great. The second track is fine. And then from there and there and there, it just kind of dissolves into this gel of the same idea over and over and over and over again, which is super unfortunate because I honor their contributions to the history of music and what they've done in order to usher in, I would say, the new wave of heavy metal, because I think they were also kind of straddling both sides of traditional and new wave heavy metal, and they were bringing in some really great stuff, but then they just didn't get off of it. They didn't go further. So it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. It's still on my big list if you want to enjoy it. And then finally, kind of the same problem, Saxon, Strong Arm of the Law. There's some really great ideas in here. There's still some new wave of heavy metal ideas that Saxon's playing with and pushing the envelope on that I think will eventually become things that are more refined for other artists, other albums. But this album itself is just not tight enough. I found as I was listening to it, despite the fact that I was honoring that it was experimentational and pushing the ball forward around new wave of British heavy metal, that I was losing focus with it just because there wasn't enough here. There wasn't enough, and also they would go wayward with some of their ideas, like the tracks would go on too long or what have you. So there needed to be more editing, let's just say. Okay, so that was my conspicuous absences. So having said that, I'm curious, what did you agree with? What did you disagree with? What did I miss? There was so much that was happening in 1980. I'm sure I missed something critical, undoubtedly. What did you learn? I'm super interested still to hear about what you're learning because I'm getting some feedback from everybody about how interesting it is. But I'm curious to hear what are you learning? Are you hearing some albums for the first time that you never experienced? I'm just super curious. Feel free to hit us up on Instagram. Not Scary, Just Music Pod. I'm curious for you all to rate us and leave comments here on Spotify or wherever else that you're listening to this. Let me know. I'm interested. It's a discourse. I'm not in a vacuum just shouting into the nothingness. Like, I want to hear what you all have to say about this stuff. So because of that, I would encourage you to go check out the Essential playlist and my bigger playlist for 1980. They're both linked in the description of this episode. Like I said, rate us, comment, find us on Instagram, Not Scary, Just Music Pod. Subscribe if you'd like to keep going on this crazy journey with us. We have a long road to go, right? Because it's 1980. It's 2024 right now. There's at least 45 years worth of music before I even go back to 1950 and go to 78. There's a lot here. There's a lot of ground to cover. So let's go on the journey together. Please make sure to join us again. Make sure to tell your friends, your enemies, your rivals, strangers on the street, whatever you want to do, let them know. Because at the end of the day, this is really about us sharing all of this music and these experiences together. I could be continuing to do this project all by myself, all by my lonesome. And I'm doing this podcast because I want us all to enjoy this thing together and to be getting these new experiences and having discussions about this album versus that album or why this one was important and that one wasn't important. And also to perhaps alleviate some of the worry or concern about, am I listening to the right stuff? Am I not listening to the right stuff? Because none of that matters. Because at the end of the day, it's not scary, right? It's just music. Thanks for listening.